Hi everyone, welcome to week 11. This is the final week of the module in which we're going to discuss primary readings and go through new material. In week 12, after the Christmas break, we will be doing some exam revision. So, this is the last topic for the module, and it's very much a continuation of last week's topic. So, just to summarize, there we were looking at Wittgenstein's conception of world picture propositions, or propositions that describe our world picture. We looked at lots of interesting features of such propositions, namely that they are foundational in some sense. They look empirical, but they aren't in fact empirical because no experience could prove them false. We looked at the role that those propositions played, and we said that they look like empirical propositions, but they're not, because they actually play a different role than empirical propositions do. They play the role of expressing a rule about the use of a certain word. And they also play a role of being a proposition serving as a fixed point against which we can go and make further inquiries. So world picture propositions aren't themselves subject to doubt. Then we looked in detail at Wittgenstein's discussion of doubt, of doubting, of the game of doubting, and some of the rules involved with doubting. And skepticism cropped up last week, insofar as it's obvious that to be skeptical is to express a doubt, but we didn't really face it head on. This week, we're looking specifically at the issue of skepticism, and we're going to bring together all of Wittgenstein's previous thoughts that we looked at last week on to the issue of skepticism. But first, I want to start by introducing another philosopher. And if you've been reading the passages of uncertainty, you'll notice, or I hope you've noticed, that Wittgenstein repeatedly refers to this person called More. And he always says things like, More says this, but can we really say this? And he repeatedly uses this person More as a kind of interlocutor to stimulate his own thoughts. So More was a British philosopher called G.E. Moore, who was active in the early part of the 20th century, very, very late 19th, but primarily mostly in the early part of the 20th century, between something like the 1890s and the 19th century, all the way up to about the 1930s or early 40s. In the 20th century, and Wittgenstein knew Moore very well. They had been friends, and then they'd fallen out for about 10 years. And then when Wittgenstein returned to Cambridge in 1929, him and Moore started to develop a relationship again. Now, Moore is important because he wrote several papers in which he intends to respond to skepticism, or defeat skepticism, or put pressure on skepticism. So Moore is famous for being a champion of common sense philosophy, and for not thinking that the skeptical challenges of philosophy need to be worried about. So the first thing to say is, what kind of skepticism are we interested in here? And I think what Moore has in mind, or what Wittgenstein takes Moore to have in mind, is something like external world skepticism. So this is the view, the very familiar view, that it's conceivable that everything you look at, everything you experience, is just purely a product of your mind. So that you're the only person that really exists. Or, well, I am, from my point of view, I'm the only person that really exists. All of these objects that seem like they're going to remain in existence even if I died wouldn't remain in existence even if I died. So, for instance, got a book here. Ordinarily, we'd think, well, if I walked outside and got run over by a bus, the book wouldn't zap out of existence. But according to external world skepticism, it would, because there's no separate realm apart from me. If I die, everything goes with me. And it's part of that view, I suppose, that even one's own body is mind-dependent. So your hands, and we've been using propositions about hands a lot this week and last week, your hands are mind-dependent entities. Whereas if you died, your hands wouldn't exist. So that's just a small refresher of the kind of skepticism which Moore was dealing with. And basically what's gonna happen this week is we're gonna see what Moore's response was, and then we're gonna see Wittgenstein say, I don't think Moore's response works, but nevertheless, skepticism can be defeated. So Wittgenstein isn't a skeptic. He doesn't agree with Moore's defense of common sense or response to skepticism, but nonetheless he thinks that he can arrive at a successful one. And I think it's fair to say that he is inspired to take up the issue by an extended engagement with Moore on the issue. So we have to look first at what Moore said. So there's some very famous papers. In particular, there's two which I've uploaded. One is called Proof of an External World, and one is called A Defense of Common Sense. And they're related but different. So I think we should start with a proof of an external world, and I'm just going to briefly outline what Moore says there. So Moore says that he can prove the existence of an external world. And in the first part of the paper, he defines what it is for something to count as a kind of external object. He doesn't use that phrase, but that's what he's doing. And an external object is one such that it's not contradictory to suppose that it existed while no one was conscious. So it's not contradictory to suppose that this book exists while no one is conscious. It's just not a contradiction. It's fine. You can say that. As opposed to things like dreams, memories, it is a contradiction to say there is currently a dream in process, but no one is alive, for instance. Or, I mean, to be more precise, because we're focusing on the word conscious, let's say it's not a contradiction to say that, it is a contradiction to say that someone is remembering something somewhere and yet no one is conscious. So that's a contradiction. But with things like books and rulers, it's not a contradiction to say that they exist and simultaneously to say that no one is conscious. So that's what Moore defines as being an external object. And now Moore says that he can prove the existence of an external world if he can prove that there are such objects as those whereby it's not a contradiction to say that they exist and to say that no one is conscious. So that's Moore's strategy. He thinks if he can prove the existence of external objects such that it's not a contradiction to claim that they exist and to claim that no one's conscious, then he can claim that there's an external world, because there couldn't be external objects without there being an external world. So that's the strategy. So he needs to prove the existence of external objects, and then he can prove the existence of the external world, because it's a necessary condition on there being external objects that there is an external world. And Moore's proof goes like this, although it is slightly adapted from the text, but I'll give you the gist of it. The proof goes like this: I know I have hands. Therefore, let's give it another premise. Hands are external objects. Therefore, I know that there are some external objects. And therefore, I know that there is an external world, because it's a necessary condition on the existence of external objects that there is an external world. The proof goes something like that. I know I have hands. If I know I have hands, I know there are external objects. I've already said I know I have hands, so I know that there are external objects. If I know that there are external objects, then I know that there's an external world. I do know that there are external objects, that's what I've just said, so I know that there's an external world. So Moore says he's proved the existence of an external world, and that argument is on canvas for you to scrutinise in further detail. And that argument has produced a lot of controversy in philosophy. People have disagreed. Some people have said that it begs the question because it assumes precisely what it's intending to prove. It assumes as true exactly the conclusion of the argument. That's a very famous criticism of that argument that you can chase up if you like. But Moore says, well, that this proof is perfectly good according to the criteria of what it is for something to be a proof, namely the following: the conclusion has got to be different from the premises, and the conclusion has got to be different from the premises, the conclusion's got to follow logically from the premises, and the premises have to be known to be true. And he says, well, his proof does meet all of those criteria. The conclusion, there is an external world, or I know there's an external world, is different from the premise, I know I have hands. They're different, so tick on that criterion. The conclusion follows from the premises according to the chain of reasoning which I just described. Namely, given these premises, I know I have hands. If I know I have hands, then I know there are external objects. There are external objects. If there are external objects, there's an external world. There's an external world. So the chain of reasoning appears to be valid, although obviously that can be scrutinised and challenged. So according to Moore, it ticks that criterion. And thirdly, the premises have got to be known to be true. What are his premises? Well, his first premise is, I know I've got hands. And Moore says, well, I do know that that's true. And so my proof fulfills all of the criteria that I've set out as being what it takes to be a successful proof. So it's a good proof. There's an external world, we can know it. And moreover, we can prove it in lots of different ways. We can say, I know I've got ears, and follow out the same chain of reasoning and get to an external world. Or I know that I've got feet, etc. Anything. Moore says it's easy to give a proof of the external world, and you can do it with lots of different things. In fact, there are innumerable proofs of the external world. Now, obviously, this is going to annoy philosophers, because philosophers think that what Moore needs to prove is not merely that there's an external world, but he needs to prove that he knows he's got hands. Because that's what the skeptic is challenging. They're challenging the fact that there's an external world, and they're challenging this idea that you know you've got hands. They're saying if there isn't an external world, and it's possible that there isn't, it's conceivable that there isn't, then you can't know you've got hands. So you can't use the premise that you know you've got hands to prove that there's an external world, because I'm acting as a skeptic now. I'm saying you can't know that. You can't know you've got hands. And Moore's response is to say, well, I do know I've got hands. In fact, that's the thing I'm most certain of virtually any proposition ever, is that I've got hands. I do know that. And he says, you may as well say that I don't know I'm stood up right now talking, or something like that. You just look ridiculous, basically. But I suppose that the skeptically minded philosopher isn't going to be satisfied by that. They're going to say, well, I don't care how ridiculous you think I am, I'm pushing the question as far as it can go. That's my job, I'm a skeptic. And I'm saying you can't actually, with 100% certainty, know that you've got hands. But Moore says, I do know I've got hands, and I can use that in a premise to prove the existence of the external world. And in a defense of common sense, he indicates a defense of that claim that he knows he's got hands. He says he's more certain of that claim than of the truth of any skeptical argument to the contrary. So any skeptical argument will have to proceed according to some lines. A skeptical argument will have to assume a premise or several premises. And Moore says, well, given your premises as a skeptic, and given my premise that I know I've got hands, mine is definitely going to beat yours in terms of certainty. So he does defend his premise elsewhere, but not in a proof of an external world, where he simply asserts that he knows it. But I think his background reasoning is that there's nothing you can be more certain of than that you've got hands, and any skeptical argument to the contrary must rely on premises which are more uncertain than is the premise that you know you've got hands. So his wins based on the balance of certainties. His premise wins, and that's why he's permitted to go and use it in the proof of the external world. So that's Moore's, this is a very skeletal picture of his response to skepticism, but that's something like it. He has a proof for the external world, where he gets from the premise that he knows he's got hands to the existence of the external world, and he defends his knowledge of his hands by appeal to the claim that any claim to the contrary or any argument to the contrary must employ premises which are less certain than is his claim that he knows he has hands. So his wins. And you'll find both these arguments in these two papers, and they connect and support one another. So that's the background that we need in order to proceed, in order to see what Wittgenstein's response was. Wittgenstein, as I said, didn't think that Moore's proof of an external world worked, didn't think his defense of common sense worked, but that's not to say that he thought that skepticism was right. So in the next video, we're going to look at what Wittgenstein thought was wrong with Moore's view. Okay, thanks.